Next question. I have seen A20 being granted a lot these days. Then 309s. Curious to know why this is the case now. In pandemic time, it was 309, but A20, from what I've seen, is the average 5 to 7 months. Yes, I would agree. I would say that from February onwards, and this was something that I mentioned earlier, overall, generally speaking, on and offshore applications are taking longer, whether it's a 309 or it's an A20. We do feel that they're taking longer across the board. Then I would certainly differentiate offshore to onshore. I would say, okay, yes, they're both being affected, but I will say that offshore are likely to being affected more so than onshore. Why could that be? Well, if you think about it logically, and this was something that I mentioned before, offshore applications are assessed at offshore consulates and embassies. So during COVID, those offshore consulates and embassies, because the border was closed, were not assessing much, because the government weren't granting many visas, because only certain visas were exempt from travel exemption requirements, and they just simplified the whole process and they said, we're just not even going to look at most visa types unless you get a travel exemption. And the only people that could get travel exemptions really were a very finite list of people, mainly partner visas, mainly partners of Australians. So therefore, because travel exemptions were being granted to partners of Australians, it meant that offshore partner visas could be decided. And because they weren't deciding anything else, we saw a very quick turnaround for offshore applications. In simple terms, maybe I can draw this. You have offshore consulates and embassies, okay? So Australian consulates and embassies that before COVID, they were really only assessing a handful of visa types. They were not assessing student visas, working holiday visas. They were not assessing visitor visas, really. I mean, it's some, but the majority were not. Now, when you look at the statistics, these make up a very large percentage of all visa types granted to Australia for those offshore. Very large. I don't have the precise number, but from memory, these visa types make up 80 to 90% of temporary visas granted to Australia every year. So, because these were not being assessed, you had all these case officers that needed something to do. And thankfully, even though the border was closed and they were not assessing these visa types, what they were assessing were partner visa applications. So it meant that all these case officers could be allocated and trained on partner visa criteria, which reduced the processing time of applications. Because not only were they able to process through new applications sooner, they were able to process through old applications, so backlog of applications that were otherwise sitting there pending. So in short, partner visas were prioritized because there wasn't much else being assessed. Now, that's back then. Since February 2022 onwards, it's changed. They're now assessing student visas, they're assessing working holiday visas, they're assessing visitor visas. They want to incentivize the return of international students. It's a financial gain, to have international students here. It's one of our largest export markets. The Australian economy relies and is dependent on international students. There's incentives now, I've read, to bring working holiday visa holders in, because that ties into labor shortages, it ties into spending, and visitor visas as well. They want to kickstart the tourism industry that's been devastated over the last 24 months. So not only are they reassessing these visa types, I would say that likely you'll probably find that they're prioritizing these visa types from a what's in the interests of Australia perspective. So in some sense, the flow-on effect is that if these are being prioritized, these are not, and it's not to say they're not going to process them at all. It is to say though that when you look at this and you understand the logic, it's explainable why case officers now being allocated or reallocated, and obviously this is all general, being reallocated to look at these visa types, which has now a flow-on effect on partner visa processing offshore and likely will lead to increased processing averages. So if anyone wants to critique my interpretation, what I would, the future will tell you if I was right or wrong, because what you'll be able to do is gather what the average processing times were for 309s, that were lodged in, let's say, the 12 months before, 2021 to February 2022 versus, February 2022 to February 2023, and compare what the processing averages were kind of globally. And I will predict that you'll see that these were much faster than this, and there's a key point in time. It's from February, which is when the border opened, to these visa types, in the sense that they didn't need travel exemptions anymore. And, travel exemptions have pretty much been scrapped. So that's why, and yes, I do agree, I do feel that offshore applications are taking longer. And that is why that diagram that I drew regarding visitor visas, that's why that strategy, the plan of trying to bring your partner in on a visitor visa first, is becoming more and more relevant, and certainly something that I include in any planning session or any coaching call or anything related to trying to discuss options for couples that are overseas or separated. We are often fleshing out the pros and cons of a visitor visa initially, because this is why. Because the offshore applications, we don't know how long they're going to take. And we have to expect that they're going to take longer than what they used to. So to avoid couples being in that position where they're physically apart for longer, it's certainly worth considering a visitor visa of some type. Even if, though, you've already submitted an offshore partner visa, it doesn't mean you can't submit a visitor visa. And that might be relevant in your case. Having a visitor visa granted whilst you're waiting for the offshore 309. So first, you can have more than one application pending. You can have an offshore visitor visa, you can have an offshore partner visa submitted, and they can grant the visitor visa even if you're still waiting for the partner visa. And you can come in on your visitor visa, and at the moment, they can grant you the partner visa that was submitted offshore whilst you're here. So it's certainly something that might be relevant to certain couples that have already applied for offshore partner visa that are concerned about the length of time it's going to take. In those instances, they may be considering submitting a visitor visa and seeing whether or not it's granted, then making the next decision about possibly coming on shore. Just to be clear, if you come in on that in those circumstances, as in you've applied for the offshore partner visa, you come in on a visitor visa, you are not eligible for a bridging visa associated to that offshore application. Okay, there's no bridging visa associated to the offshore application in that scenario. So you need to things get more complicated in terms of trying to maybe extend that person's stay onshore whilst they're waiting for that offshore partner visa. There might be a couple of avenues, nothing that I can, go into detail now and in this stream, especially with a few minutes left. But just understand that as a starting point, if you have a pending offshore application a pending 309 in the pipeline, and you're concerned about how long it's going to take, you're concerned about this, then it might be worth considering and looking at submitting an offshore visitor visa to spend some of that waiting time with your partner, or bring your partner here, waiting for that eventual outcome.